Thanks for inviting me. I have to say the talks have been really good, so I think I shall just go for speed. But I work part of my time for NHSE and partly on the GIRF programme with Geraint and partly in another role for GIRF. So in the last 2 or 3 years, I've tried to get my head around this pretty complicated system, as Charlie pointed out. So it's really important, but I think the timing for this meeting is really helpful to me, and I think I've got some, or at least I hope I've got some good news for you that I'll come to in a second. But let me give you a bit of background about essentially what my life is like. So as picking up on what you've just said, Geraint, about not being taken seriously, this is actually a problem, but I think we are trying to solve it, because the pushback over that was we may not take neurology very seriously, but we take brain disease very seriously, because we take stroke very seriously, and we take dementia very seriously, and we take mental health very seriously. So they pushed that straight back. So one thing that we've really made a big effort to do, both through the GIRF programme and through other mechanisms, is to work much closer with stroke, which I know happens on the ground, but it hasn't necessarily happened politically. And there is a major stroke review going on at the moment, and I think we'll correct this, but neurology doesn't get a big mention in the drafts, and I think we'll have to correct that. We've also had away days with dementia, and we'll have away days with mental health to try and pull all of this together, because at the moment, clinically it's often split up, but administratively it is definitely split up with completely different national clinical directors for this, that and whatever, who don't necessarily talk to each other. So we are trying to correct that, and I think we're making some progress on that. And one of the good news things I've got about MS, I think, is one, it's good for MS, and two, it's a signal that we are being taken a lot more seriously than we were. And of course, we've got these very odd discrepancies that neuro often leads research on stroke or leads research on dementia, and yet we hadn't got as involved with service provision as we should do. And yes, if you're talking about translational research, obviously, how are you going to do that without the patients and the clinics? So I think we will make progress, not necessarily in my lifetime in this job, but we can make a start. So I just want to educate you in a sense about some of these terms, because not everybody understands them, including me, not so far ago. So the CRG used to be for neurology, and there's a separate one for neurosurgery and a separate one for radiology. So they've amalgamated them, which was opposed, I think, by some, but I'd like to think it's working better. And I think they probably won't be called CRGs. I think the next iteration of this, we may see further amalgamation and actually land up with a brain CRG. And I think that might be very complicated to run, but I actually think might be a big advantage. And I don't know that for sure, but I've got a feeling that this kind of nagging about stroke and dementia and all the rest of it may actually land up with not just the GIRF programme putting us in a basket together, if you like, but also NHSE. So at the moment, CRG includes neurosurgery, neuropsychiatry, neurophysiology, and a fair bit of radiology, mainly interventional, and a fair bit of stroke, because thrombectomy is specialist funding, because it's a SpecCom, even if the rest of stroke care is CCG funded. So we've already got something that I think is on the way to something that could land up being a sort of powerful sort of political weapon to get us taken seriously. NNAG, I think, in the end, will merge. This was a compromise because the Neurological Alliance were unhappy a few years ago, got into Parliament, and so the eventual agreement was that this which I also chair, and there's a lot of overlap. We often had the meetings on the same day. Quite a few people are on both. So why have different ones? Well, we are allowed to do things that specialist commissioning wouldn't allow us to do on the CRG. In other words, we can essentially do what we like. So that is turning into quite a powerful group, I think. And if any of you feel left out, you're very welcome. And I've already invited or about to invite Charlie to come and talk to us. And Geraint will come and talk to us at the next one about GIRFT. So if you feel you're left out and want to actually talk to us, then I can invite you to that if you've got something important to say. So we can deal with CCG funding. We can deal with things that the CRG wouldn't really allow to bring up, like coding and care plans and all of that kind of stuff. So I may come back to some of that in the context of MS. So Geraint's already talked about GIRFT, which I think is a massive opportunity to sort things out. So just a bit more on the CRG. We've got an immunotherapy subgroup and an MS subgroup that's chaired by Jackie and Alistair, and I'll come back to the need to expand that a bit and give it a slightly different function. We've got a data subgroup. We often get asked for advice and consultations, and I think have got a much better relationship with the ABN and the SBNS, so that essentially the advice comes back to whoever the ABN or I think can give it. And obviously medicinal cannabis was very much on the agenda yesterday, so we talked to various people, including John, and the ABN are setting up a guideline committee that you'll probably talk about later. So, but it's a good example of working really closely together with professional organisations, including the surgeons. There's a GP document that we weren't very happy about and still not entirely happy about, but again, working with the ABN and the SBNS will try and make it as good as possible. Though NICE, like a lot of these organisations, are not the easiest people to deal with. We need to define the neurology spec. We've done neurosurgery, we've done interventional radiology, we've done neurosurgery, and I could come back to questions on that if you like, but we really need to define, it comes into what Geraint was saying, we really need to define what is specialist, what should be specialist funded, how should specialist services, including MS, run. And we'll bring that into the review that I'll mention in a second. We do link with pediatrics, which is important for MS, but also important for various other things, and with other things, including rehabilitation. Charlie mentioned networks. I'll probably come back to that. I think these networks are really important, and a research network that you've got, or a network that you've got going for another function, often is a really good way of getting people together in general and working on other things that aren't perhaps the prime purpose of the network that was set in the first place. Other people have mentioned this. Things have got to happen at different levels. At a national level, even we've come across with thrombectomy. The chief executive, oh God, you're taping this, aren't you? But he wants thrombectomy to happen, but it's actually quite hard for him to happen, and he's chief executive of the whole thing. So you can be helpful at a national level, I hope. But at the end of it, as you mentioned with the GIRFT programme, a lot has to be done at a regional level. And at the end of it, somebody has to write a business case locally, usually, for most things. So we might be able to find data, Right Care might be able to find data, GIRFT might be able to find data that helps you write that business case. But at the end of it, if you want another nurse or another neurologist, nobody can give you that. It has always got to be done through your trust and through your division, and the commissioners can't order it either. You might be able to get their support. So it is really important that we realize that we can do so much at this level, so much at that level, so much at that, but everybody's got to do their bit, and the whole thing is recursive, and we can all learn from each other. And so it may sound obvious, but I think that's the way forward. And networking, as was mentioned earlier, is really important for MS, but I think for an awful lot of other things as well. Okay, don't read this because some people are sick of seeing it, including me probably. But but it's just an example of a challenge I was given 2 or 3 years ago before I took on any jobs like this. Was could you put what good looks like for neurology, neurosurgery on a single slide? So I haven't on purpose changed this, but it shows it can be done, and we obviously have to deal with other. Not just MS, but actually getting people to just write down for simpletons like myself to some extent, but also people who are not in neurology at all, what you actually think a good MS service should look like or epilepsy service is remarkably difficult. So you'd really help me if you'd actually accept this challenge and actually do it, because I can't get it out of anybody else. So you could be the first. And you've got to interact with your community. You've got to go around. You've got to have epilepsy surgery. You don't have epilepsy surgery. You've got to have the sort of 1 or 0.1% in there, or the whole thing falls apart. You've got to have research in there. You've got to have the relationship with your regional centre and stuff like that in there. So if you could do that for MS, I think it doesn't have to be quite like that. So a few random thoughts, and a few more have come up on the very good talks earlier. So clearer pathway, I think, would be really helpful. Network, you've already mentioned. MDTs, all of the, all this governance stuff is really important about reducing variation. And as somebody said, you may not be able to reduce the variation, but you may just up the game and make a better service, even if there's still variation, which there will be at the end of it. As you're getting here, full engagement with charities. Somebody in my job is basically not interested if it hasn't been through the charities and you don't have some sort of industry support, because it'll get picked up. Because we have PPV representation in force, quite rightly, on all of our committees. So if you land up doing something that you kind of are pushing towards us, it is much better if you've done all of that in the first place, which I'm sure you have. And I think MS is a good example of people working really well together. So I'm not criticizing you at all. I actually think you're probably better than most. CME nurse training, is really important issues. We'd like to see more about rehab, I think, and more about mental health in general, and that's true for the whole of neurology. So I'll come to this work stream for the service review. I'll explain the service review in a minute. So as of last week, we got agreement to do a service review, very much in with the GIRF program, so people aren't going off in different directions. I think this is a really important signal. It's a really hard hurdle to get across. It's resisted. We had to make the case, and then we weren't sure what case we were trying to make, so it's been round and round, so it's been a very irritating process. But we've got through it, and now to some extent, I think we can actually do, we've got more freedom to do, the right thing in a way. It's a big spec commie at the moment, but that may break down. So there's some cross-cutting themes like care planning, like data and coding and stuff that cut across all of neurology. But we were accused of being unfocused if we didn't say what our priority areas were. Now that doesn't mean, fortunately for MS, it's not an issue, but if there were neuromuscular people in the room, it does not mean that we won't get around to it, but we had to say what were the crucial things in the first place. So, whoops, I've gone backwards. So we had to say epilepsy, partly because it's common, partly because of mortality, so I won't talk about that. We have definitely said MS, and that's gone through. So I need to talk to you a little bit about that, and immunotherapy, because immunoglobulin and plasma exchange are such big deals. So that's where we're going to start. So how are we going to do that? And there's also 3 or 4 for neurosurgery, and as I said, there are the cross-cutting themes. So, but just on MS. So the way we see it, which is almost set up because of the subgroup on immunotherapy, the way we see it is that we probably have to arrange somebody to be chair, but then it's important that they set up a group that involves charities heavily, that involves you guys, including nursing in a major way, that is kind of regionalized from the beginning, complicated by the fact that nobody can decide how many regions there are in the UK. So if it goes to 7, I don't know if there'll be 7, but at the moment I think of 4. So it's important that you have input into that, and you could talk privately or publicly about that, and that there's pharmacy involved and all the rest of it. So it's a 2 to 5 year program. There will be support for you. I actually think with GIRF going along in parallel, and rehab going along in parallel, and there's a stroke review, which is nothing to do with you, going along in parallel, we've got a real opportunity to actually bring these things together and actually get some good things implemented. I think somebody kind of said it, but I do wonder if you realize how much power you've got, or how much power something like this could give you. So if there are things, I mean, I didn't know much about this originally, but commissioners don't sit around making stuff up to make your lives difficult. It's nearly always coming from advice that you've given them. So if you don't like EDSS or whatever, then get rid of it, but there will need to be some sort of outcome. You need to replace it with something on the outcome measure, or the neurosurgeons, unfortunately, in some ways are ahead of us, probably because it's a bit easier, that we do need outcome and quality measures in the system. But if you don't like the one that you've got because it's taking too long or it's no use, then come up with something else. And the commissioners will listen. They'll have to listen. I think realize that as long as you can be reasonably consistent and keep the debates inside, but when you actually go outside and talk to people, keep it simple and straightforward, they really don't have much choice but to listen to you. So, I think I'll probably suffer the fate of Captain Cook, but I do see that MS, despite what you probably think, is actually ahead of a lot of other areas of neurology and even neurosurgery, and that you're actually doing really well. But I'd ask you to keep it up, because I think you will get there. So thank you.
Positive questions.
Thirsty.
People are thirsty. There's a question over there.
Thank you, Adrian. One of the areas that's really far behind in neurology, as I can see and all of us have experienced, is the issue of rehabilitation and mental health issues, particularly when we talk about MS and access to that. How's the NHS England looking into this, and is there a solution on site?
Well, I think if everybody, we were at this NNAG group yesterday, so there will be an away day. We're talking to the mental health czar, or whatever he calls himself, and because it's come up in, not just in MS, it basically comes up as a big issue for all neurological diseases, and not counting the sort of purely functional disease that is obviously we spend most of our life dealing with. So it is a massive issue. So I can't answer your question except that we're kind of onto it. But I think as far as the MS is concerned, I think if you drive that kind of agenda through this, new working party, working stream, whatever you want to call it, then again, it'll be really helpful, and you probably will get somewhere. Neuropsychiatry is on the CRG, but that's just for specialist stuff that happens within regional centres at the moment.
Hi, thanks for that. You mentioned a number of initiatives that are going on to kind of identify standards or guidelines or outcomes in MS and neurology more broadly, and we haven't touched on the NICE guidelines, which are also up for review next year. I suppose just there's finite resources available to work on all of these things. Where would you see kind of the greatest impact? Where should we focus on?
Right, I can only really see it from my perspective. I think it would be a shame because, you know, the group can't be that large. It'll be a shame if we don't get some really positive people on to the review. But the reality is, you know, only 3 or 4 people, consultants and some nurses, and you know, so it won't be that big of a group, but it will have to have some geographical spread. So, I mean, I take your point, but NICE will decide who's on their guideline, you know, and you know what they're like about who they pick, but I don't know how on earth you influence that. But presumably anybody who's come to this meeting can't do it. Maybe they'll relax their, but my understanding is that from, and I'm probably giving the wrong answer, that nobody thinks that the revision of the NICE guideline will be a lot of work, because it doesn't include the drugs, is that right? And so I wonder if that really would be that time consuming.
It would be time consuming. So you're actually saying the review of the NICE guidance and the NICE standards are not going to be a big issue in terms of workload?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, I'm just from gossip, really, that I get, because it doesn't include the DMTs or anything like that, does it? No. So, I mean, I can't remember. Well, I did read it once, or at least some of it. But I mean, if you're not talking about drugs, how much work can it be? I don't know. You've read it, hopefully.
Well, it's up to me. Is Dr. Breaks in the audience? Peter, you were last time. How much work is it?
No, the original, but will the revision be?
I don't know. I've not heard anything about the revision at all, so maybe
No.
I've been thrown off.
No.
Maybe because I came today.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for this.
Okay, thank you.